All right. Hello and welcome to our Ask a Doctor, Rig Doctor live Q&A. We're going to be going over some of the stuff that had been sort of commonly asked questions, things that had come up through the course of the comments based on the video that we published a little earlier in the week, which is pedal myths debunked. And we talk about 5 different pedal myths or pedal board related myths that are often perpetuated. And so we kind of went and kind of scoured the common places on Facebook and Instagram um, and also forums and things like that to kind of see what some of the most common misunderstandings were and where they're perpetuated, and then kind of address those things where they are and maybe how that relates to some of the stuff that we regularly talk about in terms of pedalboard best practices. So we're going to use the first part of our time today to talk about some of the common things that came up there, some of the things we saw in the comments. We also put on Instagram a question about kind of getting things compiled and things that people are interested in talking about as it relates to their rigs. You're also, of course, welcome to comment at any time in the chat here, and we will get to that question as quickly as we can. And of course, we'll try to prioritize any super chats if and when those come in. And then after that, there's a few other kind of unrelated questions to the pedal myths that kind of came in through YouTube, which we'll also get to, which I think are just kind of good housekeeping. Another thing to just note about today is that we're kind of trying out and experimenting with some different formats along these lines. But if you can see that there's kind of a timestamp in the corner that's counting down from 45 minutes. And so we're trying to kind of limit these to about 45 minutes. We're trying to do them once a week. And then the remaining 15 minutes will be designed for the people that are part of sort of our private stream, that are people that have signed up through the rigdr.com, where we have private consulting and private services that are for that people can hire for pay. And so this is kind of a private chat for those people that will kind of be the remaining 15 minutes. So we'll go 45 minutes is open to everybody, and then the remaining 15 minutes will be private for those people. And if you're interested in any of those things, we offer one-on-one consulting with me and also with some of the other people that work here at Vertex. And you'll have several different options that you can employ. But also, if you don't have the money and you want to be involved in this conversation beyond the scope of what this is, we actually offer a free account version. So you can actually just head to therigdr.com and you can request a free account, and you'll actually be able to be part of that private chat that happens. So just send us an email. There's no means testing, anything like that. You just simply say that you can't afford it right now, whatever the reason may be, it doesn't matter. We will grant you that free access. We don't want money to be what keeps you between good tone, so we want to make sure that everybody is able to be included in that. So feel free to hit us up on that if for any reason you are not able to afford it. We are happy to oblige. So again, we want to start with the pedal myths. Again, this is what we had for our YouTube video that was released on Wednesday. And it was really interesting to see some of the different pieces of feedback and some of the commentary about it. And so I kind of want to get into that. And again, if anything comes up for you as I'm saying any of this, please feel free to put that in the chat. We'll try to get to what we can. I already see a bunch of friends here. We got Sean Tubbs. How's it going, man? Love Sean Tubbs. What a fantastic player. Gabby Bergman. All right. And Honduras. People are coming in from all over. Scott. Hey. Awesome. I'm glad to see that we have some regulars, some recurring friends here. So in the pedal myths, the very first thing that we talked about was that solderless cables are being equal to soldered cables. And so we debunked that in kind of talked about some of the reasons why. But some of the pieces of feedback on this were that we were being unfair to solderless cable companies and undermining their business as a result of the commentary. And I want to be really clear that if anybody wants to use solderless cables, they're at liberty to do whatever they'd like to do. But when we're trying to come up with recommendations for what's the pro level standard and what is going to be the best possible connection for your devices, I can in good conscience say that a solderless cable is equal to a soldered one. And there are some people that had said, well, there's these other there's one rig builder that they're aware of that uses them, and he's built for these pro level guys. And that's one guy. That's one guy out of the entire body of rig builders. And if we're looking at the legacy guys that have been doing this for 30 years, Robert Bradshaw, Dave Friedman, Exactone, LA Sound Design, Steen Skridstrup, Paul Lenders. I mean, Pete Cornish, I can't think of one other guy that's making their living doing this that has ever recommended solderless cables. And we've done a lot of different interviews with different rig builders where they've explained why, and it pretty much mirrors exactly the party line that I've been giving. And so I would say that for anybody that's wondering, should I convert my solderless cables to soldered ones, I think that if the rig is working for you and you're not having reliability issues and your rig is relatively sedentary, maybe it's not time to disrupt your rig and start, soldering all your connections. Equally, the cable itself, the wire, is not the problem. If you have a bunch of solderless cables and you're having some reliability problems, you can always solder those and you can eliminate a lot of that, presuming that you're soldering it correctly, or you take it to somebody to have them solder it for you. And the other thing is that some people have said, well, there's other industries that use solderless, and it's much more high stakes than pedalboard stuff. And when they say that, that is true. There are some solderless connections that are actually superior to a soldered one, but not in our industry. And the reason why is that nobody can afford those tools. It's on a consumer level. So like in some of the stuff in like a NASA spaceship, they have a $5,000 or $10,000 crimping tool that literally cold welds the two different metals together to create a bond. And that thing has to be calibrated like every 500 crimps. Otherwise, it's not applying the right pressure to create that cold weld. Nobody's going to pay $5,000 for a crimper to come with their solderless cable system. So I guess it's true. Yes, you can find some solderless connections in certain industries that are way more high stakes than pedals, but the cost is so high that you would never see that here. So it is true that you can get some solderless connections that are superior to a soldered one, but not in our industry and not at the price points that people are talking about. So just wanted to kind of go over that about kind of the point number one and some of the pushback that we got from a few people about that. And that I mean, this is like very scientific and easy to prove in terms of the quality of the connections. I just, anybody who's disputing this, it's like a flat earth conspiracy at this point. I just don't see why there is any controversy here, other than just kind of a dogma that people have adopted from somebody else that they think is a better teacher for them. And I can't compete with an opinion. But if they want the facts, this is the fact. The second thing that we talked about was all buffers are created equally. And it's interesting, we actually got a quote that somebody had posted and said, well, I had heard from this other video that I watched from a very prominent YouTuber that he said, well, it doesn't matter what buffer it is, all buffers are great. And I thought that sort of encapsulated some of the commentary that we saw on this point. And it really is not true. They're just like you can't say that all overdrives are great overdrives. The same would be true of buffers. They're not all great. And a buffer really, at its core, has no color. It means it shouldn't do anything to the tone. It shouldn't change anything about the signal in terms of adding distortion, changing the compression, changing the EQ. All of those things are the antithesis of a buffer. A buffer is unity gain, a one-to-one amplifier. Whatever comes in on the input goes out on the output, put down at low impedance, so it's going to be a lot less sensitive. And really, impedance is just a fancy word to say how sensitive is this. If it's really high impedance, it means it's really sensitive to everything. If it's low impedance, it means it's not that sensitive to other stuff. And when you convert it to low impedance on the output, you're hoping that you're going to have as minimal effect on the things that are following it as possible. Now, saying that all buffers are great buffers, it's really not true because buffers vary all over the place. In fact, I'd say probably 1 in 20 are actually in a spec that you would want. I gave kind of a good litmus test for that. I said 1 meg on the input, 100 ohm on the output. That's a pretty good baseline that if your buffer is falling within that specification, you probably have something that's pretty good. Now, there's a few caveats to that. There's some guys that are using a TLO 72 IC, and you can run that pretty close to 0 ohms on the output and 1 meg on the input. The problem is even if you talk to Texas Instruments, who manufactures that chip, TI will tell you that you need to have a 1K output on that chip. Otherwise, it's not stable, and the current output is terrible. It's like the worst chip if you want something linear. The TLO 72 is great for an overdrive because it has a cool color to it. It's not great for a buffer when you're trying to keep it as linear as possible. So there are some ways to cheat that, but again, the best reference tool that I can use is just go back to our recommended buffers, and you'll see the ones that we've tested. I mean, I've really tried to test everything here to try to make sure that we have as exhaustive of a list of things that meet that criteria, so it takes the guesswork out of it. And if there's another one that you think that we should consider that maybe we haven't, we're always happy to test that stuff and give you the best information that we can. But not all buffers are created equal. Most are terrible. Some are okay. Few are great. And the best cheap one out there, honestly, is the True Tone one. It's only a single buffer, so you'd have to get 2 of them really to buffer a system properly, just a mono system all in front of an amp. But for $50, it's pretty incredible that they can make it that cheaply. It's very good, uses a nice IC, is built well, simple, but very effective. And then we of course have more sophisticated recommendations on in our description as well for this video. And I'll make sure that Mejia also throws those in this description just in case anybody's wondering. Another thing that we talked about were isolated isolated power supplies, and that all of them are the same. And we made this distinction between the 2 different types of power supplies, one being a linear, the other one being a switch mode. And there was some folks that asked where's the switch mode or a linear supply, and I thought an easy way that I should have said to distinguish those two is typically a linear supply will only work in one country. So they'll have the toroidal transformer or semi-toroid or R-core or C-core. It'll just be wound for one specific voltage. So if you're in the United States, you need one power supply. If you go to Europe, you'll need to get a different one. There are some that have a transformer that has multiple taps on it and that you can use it in multiple different countries, but you'll have to use a slider switch or some sort of toggle switch or rocker switch to make it switch between those 2 different AC voltages that are coming into it. That's generally how you can identify a linear supply from a switch mode, because a switch mode will do that automatically. Whenever it's plugged into, it'll calibrate to that and then make sure that everything gets the appropriate voltage on the output. So that's probably the easiest way to tell the difference between the 2. But in terms of the qualities, there were some people that said, well, a linear power supply will be better than a switch mode power supply because there can be all this noise associated with switch mode power supplies. And I would say if you're talking about cheap switch mode power supplies, that would be true. In the earlier days of switch mode power supplies in our industry, in the pedal industry, a lot of guys were providing really inexpensive, cheap switch mode power supplies with pedals that weren't necessarily designed for audio. And one thing with switch mode power supplies is if they're not designed for audio, you're going to get all sorts of oscillation in the audio range, and it's not going to be a good thing. You're going to kind of hear like this like sputtering or clicking or kind of like a clocking noise almost, or just this high frequency kind of whining. And that was consistent with a lot of cheaper brand pedals that were trying to provide an inexpensive supply, and they were buying stuff that wasn't really optimized for audio. But now I think people are a lot more hip to kind of what the minimum standards are. They're doing a better job of vetting the right tools. And I've rarely seen from any sort of manufacturer of note any terrible switch mode power supply. In particular, ones that are full switch mode power supplies that are not just an individual wall wart. So some of the early, like the one spots and stuff like that, those were kind of cheaper switch mode supplies, and they can be problematic. in a lot of different contexts. But the standalone supplies that they make are much better than that, and I would say are decent. And then there's some really excellent ones, like Chalks is making excellent switch mode power supplies. The new Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 3, 3 Plus, the X4, the X8, those are all excellent switch mode power supplies. Fender's got a new one. I haven't checked it out yet, but I'm trying to get my hands on one so I can test that one. That seems really promising for a budget switch mode power supply. Of course, the Strymon ZUMA and kind of the associated addendum and extension power supplies, all those look really great, and are really great. I've used those on multiple occasions. And in those, compared to their linear power supply counterpart that has the same voltage, same amount of output, all that stuff, they're better supplies. They're lighter. They can do more in terms of the voltage and current. They're smaller, and they can be used anywhere in the world, and there's not going to be any issue with leakage of the magnetic field. And that was really one of the big things that we were emphasizing in the video, is if you have a switch mode power supply underneath the pedal, there's no problem. You don't have this issue with the magnetic field leakage that's going to get into the system or into your pedals and create noise. When you have a linear power supply, especially ones that are trying to match what the switch mode power supply equivalent is of like a Zuma or a Chalk 7 or a Voodoo Lab Pedal Power 3, if you're trying to get a linear one to match that, ordinarily they can't use steel chassis anymore because they generate so much more heat to be able to produce that much voltage and that much more current. So what ends up happening is you get this really, really intensified magnetic field that has no more shielding anymore, because you can't use steel. You have to go to aluminum because they use the chassis as a heat sink. Some of the earlier Voodoo Lab versions, like the Mondo and the 4x4, use this, but they weren't the only ones. They went away from steel because they needed to be able to dissipate this heat somehow. But when they went to that type of metal, they had no more shielding anymore. And even sometimes if you put different types of caps and stuff like that on your toroid, you're still not going to eliminate all the leakage. And so what would happen if you get pedals over this linear supply, you would put it right in the magnetic field, and the more you would draw against it. So let's just say you had 1.5 amps of total power, that's 1500 milliamps. The closer you got to the limit, the more it would intensify the magnetic field. So the more of the power supply total current you used, that magnetic field would become stronger and bigger. And one easy way that you could tell this, and this is how I used to tell how big the field was and where it was intensified, is I just had an old single coil pickup that I just attached to a guitar cable, to put like a pigtail on it, and you could literally just move it around the supply, and you could get a sense for kind of where the magnetic field was most intense. And a lot of our old rigs, before switching power supplies were really a thing, you'd always see we just move all the way into the corner of the power supply because that was the only place you could put it where it wasn't going to have a negative interaction with the rest of the pedals. So that's kind of going over again switch mode power supplies. Myth number 4, we really didn't have anybody contest this or talk about this. I think that we've talked about this a few times in our video. Basically, the moral of the story is it doesn't really matter if you're talking about DC. You can put them near anything. AC is a different story. You want to make sure that those stay away from your audio cables. But if we're just talking about ordinary power supply cables, you could really cross them any way that you want. There's not going to be any consequence when we're talking DC. The last one, we didn't really get any real comments about this particular thing, but one thing that people did talk about that I thought was worth mentioning was they were talking about charge pumps in pedals. And if you don't know what a charge pump is, or a DC-DC converter, it takes the input voltage, let's pretend it's 9 volts, and then it steps it up internally inside the pedal to a higher voltage, 18 volts. And there were a lot of people that were asking the question of, well, we noticed this pattern between pedals with charge pumps and noise in our system as a result of using them. And they believed it to be some sort of pathology of charge pumps to create this problem. And the thing I always wanted to clarify is that there is no difference. Like if it's designed properly, the charge pump is not the issue, right? The charge pump can be used effectively without creating any noise. I think generally if you're seeing noise associated with the charge pump, it's either something else that you're unfairly attributing to the charge pump, or if it is in fact the charge pump, it's something inside the pedal and the way that it was designed that didn't account for a contingency around the way that it was going to be powered. And you have to remember that most pedal builders are not rig builders. So their association with pedals is typically pretty individualistic. I've found from working with some of these people in the industry, and they're not thinking about the upstream or downstream consequences when they're building a pedal board. They're thinking about just the pedal on its own. One advantage that I've always found that we had is that the first 10 years that I was ever working and doing this stuff, I wasn't really making pedals. I was mostly just building rigs and doing repairs and doing mods. And I think it really made a huge difference in sort of understanding the context of how stuff would be used. And understanding that in the context of building a rig, what works together and what doesn't, which devices don't play well together and which do. Having that really, really good understanding with a pretty broad set of data points, I think really helps with that stuff. And so I think that that's something we just have to consider, that in some contexts, it's not the charge pump that's the problem. We have a couple of pedals that have DC-DC converters, like our Boost runs at plus or minus 18, or no, it's like plus or minus 15 rail to rail. It's dead quiet. Like I can't create a condition where it would cause noise unless it's like a pretty terrible power supply, like a really cheap switch mode power supply. But other than that, no real issues with those inherently. I think it's a misnomer. So we certainly have a bunch of questions that are coming in here, and we'll get to those as quickly as we can. I think maybe what we'll just do is we'll just go back and forth. Kind of, I have maybe, I don't know, 15 or 20 from Instagram. We'll kind of go back and forth on these and kind of rapid fire them, and go from there. First one is coming in from David. Thanks for all your help and advice. You're always a big help. I wish I had unlimited funds to build rigs for myself. It's fun. It's just as fun playing them. Awesome. Very cool. One coming in now from Instagram. How much of a difference I think you meant do effects loops make? I think that they make a difference only if you're providing any of the gain or distortion from the amplifier itself. So if the amplifier is dirty, right, you're using the preamp distortion in the amplifier, then an effects loop is valuable, because in essence what you would be doing at that point, if you put delay in front of the amplifier, it would be like putting your delay pedal before your distortion pedals in a clean amp. It's essentially what it's doing. So when you have distortion coming from the amplifier, putting the delays and reverbs and anything that might be sensitive and time-based would do best between the preamp and the power amp, which is what the effects loop is doing. So I would say use an effects loop if you're generating distortion from the amplifier itself. If the amplifier is clean and you're using the pedals to generate the distortion, then there's not a need for the effects loop any longer. All right, next one. Vince, how do you go about hard mounting a crybaby style wah to a pedal board? Good question. So what I do is I take off the bottom plate. I just unscrew the bottom plate so that it's just open. And I use that as a template so that I can trace with a mechanical pencil or something like that in the place that I want it. I drill through the board based on where I've drawn out the mechanical pencil for where the wah is going to sit. And then because I've used the actual bottom of the wah plate as the template, I can now screw right through. It's going to match right up. Some of the wah screws are a little short, so if you're planning to keep the rubber feet on there, which in some ways I actually recommend that you do, because it kind of creates a little bit more cushion, because the wah takes so much impact on the board. Sometimes if it's just metal on metal with the board, it can kind of like feel like it like you're gonna go away with your wah pedal. Sometimes I like to keep the rubber feet on there, and I'll just go to a hardware store and just get a replacement screw. And I'm pretty sure on most wahs I think it's a 8/32 on most of them. But you can some of them are different if they're getting kind of like a cheaper die cast. So you could just take the screw to a hardware store and just get something that's maybe 1/4 of an inch or whatever the thickness of your pedal board is longer, and then that'll be an easy way to do it. Question from Instagram. I want to talk business. Advice on how to start a pedal company. Man, I don't know if I have any really great piece of advice other than, I'm trying to think if I can distill this to one thing. I would say that if I had to do it over again, I think I would have tried to work for another pedal company. And the reason why is that learning those structures on your own and like how to manage a business in this particular field, there's so many different things that you have to be able to do well. You have to be able to, of course, make a good product, but you also have to be able to market it and get it seen. So you can have the best product in the world, and if nobody knows about it, then what do you got? You don't have anything. So I think that I wish that I had some sort of mentor to show me, like, this is how you can structure things. This is how you do a rollout of a marketing release. This is how you organize your manufacturing. This is how you budget for new pedals. Like, so these are all like a bunch of really, really critical pieces that I didn't really have anybody to show me, like a cookbook of like how to follow these things. So I think if you can work for a company in your area that is making pedals and is on some level of where they're really moving some volume, or they're the person that you would want to be. Like, you first year, maybe you're mostly just boxing and shipping stuff, and then the second year maybe you're assembling and loading pedals, and then maybe the third year you're helping with different marketing rollouts or working with artists. There's so many different sides to this, and really kind of understanding the 360 view, I think, is important. And I wish I had that, because I got to screw up way more times than I probably would have if I had somebody that was kind of saying, yeah, I think that you want to do this differently, or this is how we do this thing. So at least you'll have a template that you can kind of use when you break off on your own. And I think that would be very valuable. Let's go to another one here. Christian, can you tell us what would the rule be when it comes to using, sorry, I didn't mean to make that smaller, input and output buffers with the fuzz? Output buffer, no change. Use it exactly at the very last pedal. That rarely would you not want an output buffer. The only condition I could think of where you wouldn't want an output buffer is if either one, you already had something with a really low output impedance, like 100 ohms. Some of the Strymon stuff actually does have that low of an output impedance. So if it's the buffer's on, and you didn't want to spend extra money, you could use what's there. For the input buffer, however, if you have a fuzz, obviously you don't want to put an input buffer there. You'd want to put it after the fuzz. Or if you have a wireless, that is the buffer. So you don't need another input buffer if you already have a wireless. So it's a pretty easy contingency. If you have a fuzz, just put the buffer after it. If you have a wireless, then you don't need an input buffer. But almost in all cases, I really can't think of any case where you wouldn't want an output buffer, unless you were going balanced or something like that out of your rig, or you were, going into a DAW or something like that, and you already had a low output impedance pedal as the last pedal. I can't really see any other reasons why you wouldn't use that. Let's go to the next one. Where to put the Steel String Supreme in the chain? All right, if you're going to use it direct, then I would say at the end. If you're going to use it in front of an amp, I would say after the overdrives is the best place to put it. Let's go to another one. Britt. Just bought a Strymon ZUMA, and if I plug any pedal into the last output, it makes a loud pulsing noise in my amp. Not sure how to fix it. Not surpassing the milliamp level, I think is what she's saying. All right, so I guess, Britt, I would need more information on this, and if we run out of time here, you can always email me, and me or my team, like, email us at therigdr.com, because that's usually where we try to field more of this stuff. So I would say either there's something wrong with the supply, but there might be something wrong with the device. Like, if you unplug everything from the power supply and you just use that one, or you go to power something else other than the device that you're trying to power, does it have that same problem? Because that would help us eliminate if it's a power supply issue or it's a pedal specific issue. So if you continue to have this issue, email me and I can advise next steps. Let's see. Here it is. Running pedals through a Kemper and how to make it sound best. Well, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. I think that having some sort of nice preamp pedal before you go into a Kemper is really critical to kind of just give it some warmth and some fatness. I have a lot of clients that are using steel strings for this. But I also know a lot of people that like using the Kingsley stuff that the guys at the pedal show always talk about all the time because they have tubes in them. I'm not totally sold on tube-based pedals just because of the voltages that we're dealing with. I know Kingsley has them running, I think, at 12 volts, or I can't remember if they're on AC or what they're on, but they're higher than it's the normal 9. You like those because they kind of create a little bit more of that kind of like that tubiness warmth. I remember in the old days when guys were using more of the Line 6 pod stuff, there was a VHT buffer that had a tube in it. It was called a valvulator, I think. And a lot of guys like using that in front of the Line 6 stuff because it kind of gave it a little bit more of that tubey amp-like response. Not so much that it made it the whole thing sound like a tube amp, but it was kind of like a little bit tubier than normal. It looks like we got a super chat here, so I want to honor this person. Thanks, Corey. Corey says, thank you for being such a great source of information or info for everybody. Hope you can buy a cup of coffee. Yes, thank you. I actually got some coffee right here. So thank you, Corey, for that. I supremely appreciate it. Let's go to another one that came in. We got Britt. Okay, this is an interesting one. Scott says, I've seen a lot of people perpetuating lately that true bypass is bad. I think this is actually worth a video on its own, honestly. So I think true bypass is great. I think it's great if used appropriately. In all honesty, the best possible way that you could get your rig to be as quiet as possible without using a true bypass looper or a MIDI switcher of some kind or a programmable switcher is input buffer, 1 meg input, 100 ohm output, all true bypass in between, output buffer at the end. Same thing, 1 meg input, 100 ohm output. The output buffer input impedance isn't so critical, but the output impedance is really critical there. If you had all true bypass in between and then great buffers on the start and finish, that's probably the most transparent that you're going to get compared to actually having things wired into a loop switcher. And the reason why is that assuming everything is off and that the quality of the true bypass is good, I've seen some sort of unusual, let's say more abstract versions of true bypass where it's not really grounding out the circuit completely and it's just the input connected directly to output. Presuming that it's done right, there really shouldn't be any real additional noise. High quality buffers won't really add to the noise floor in any appreciable way where you could tell the difference between one and another. And all the pedals would just be bringing the signal one to the next to the next to the next. That would be extremely transparent. If you start adding buffers in there, maybe a few of them might be okay, but you have to remember that, like, if you're talking about a Boss pedal, you're talking about an Ibanez pedal, these are buffered pedals. They don't just have one buffer. Very few Boss pedals, in fact, just have one buffer. A lot of them have multiple buffers. And when you're talking about those BJT style buffers, like what's in those, they lose a little bit of gain with each one that you run through. So you actually lose, and sometimes when you run through them, some of them, you can lose about a half dB from input to output in your total output. You can just attenuate that by a half a dB. Also, it raises the noise floor. So for every one that you run into, you might raise the noise floor, you'll lose some output. So you have less signal at the end of it and your noise floor is louder. That's not ideal. Now, that's kind of an extreme example because typically people that have buffers, that's not all from one source and they're different brands and stuff like that. But I would say to limit the number of buffers between the input and output buffer as much as you can, knowing that any pedal that's turned on is a buffer, whether it's true bypass or not. And that's going to supersede any buffer before it. So if I have an input buffer on, and then my first pedal in line is a Cali 76 compressor that's always on, my input buffer is now only as effective as loading my pickups on the input and buffering one patch cable to my compressor. And now my compressor is the buffer from that point forward. This is why the output buffer then becomes so critical, because most pedals aren't designed to run all the cables in between all your interconnections, plus a 20-foot cable back to your amp. This is why the output buffer becomes critical, because no pedal has to make anything go too far before it hits another super high quality buffer. So I would say as much true bypass as you can and having a high quality input and output buffer. Let's see, did we talk about this one? Okay. This one is James. Do some pedal companies make higher quality pedals than others? Well, I think that certainly the parts that we use, for the most part, are coming from roughly the same source. I mean, obviously, you can get, cheaper capacitors that have higher tolerances that are not as tight. You can use, cheaper op amps, stuff that's higher noise. There's some manufacturing trade-offs there. But I think that for the most part, I would say that pedals have kind of normed a lot in terms of what the, sort of the minimum quality is. And I would say that that's good for the consumer. Most people are kind of using a pretty decent quality of stuff. And if they're going cheaper, it's on, enclosures or paint costs or things like that. I wouldn't say that there's very few companies that are really making terrible quality pedals. And I think that they're pretty obvious when you see them. I think that for the most part, everybody's game has kind of been upped in our industry, and I think that that's good for again for the consumer. You can get a fairly reliable pedal for a relatively low cost. Like boutique quality is much more ubiquitous now than it was 10 years ago. So I don't think that we need to like single anybody out on this one. I think that the ones that are clearly not good quality are pretty self-evident, and you don't need me to make that distinction. Let's go over here. Let's see. Jay Funky. Your youngest pro rig build featured a buffer as well where he could split mono. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what was running through. I believe it was a buffer, and what is stereo. Okay, so I think that the question here is he's talking about a rig build I think that we did for Asher Belsky, who's this young, super talented guitar player. You should check him out if you haven't. He's here in the Bay Area and is just super shredder, man. I mean, really, he's not really a shredder, but he's super toneful. Sounds like a guitar player that's way older than he is. So on his system, it was mono but split. So it was the same signal to two amplifiers. So there wasn't a separate signal on the left side than there was on the right side. They were the same mono signal going to both amps. The difference between that and stereo is if you had a stereo system, you'd be coming out of whatever the last number of pedals are, and they would have their own left and right channels, and they potentially would be mixed differently. They could have different timing on the left and right. Sometimes one side's inverted, so the polarity is changed. And that has a different, more kind of like wider, kind of more spatial, kind of ambient sound, because you could be getting two different sounds, two different images in each amp. In Asher's case, he just wanted sort of like a bigger, wider sound, but not necessarily like all this kind of ambient sort of structure around him. He kind of just wanted it to be kind of like this bigger, focused sound. And so using two amps allowed him to do that. And if he wanted to use one amp, then he would just plug into one of the outputs instead of two of the outputs that were there. So that was kind of that distinction there. Let's go back to Instagram. Okay, reading and using multimeters. Okay, I would say that typically multimeters for, sorry, I got a bad nose itch here. I'll take a little bit of coffee. I would say that I would use multimeters if you're kind of starting out with building a pedalboard context. I would use it just mostly on just ohms. Set it to ohms, and you can use it to buzz out your cables. You can use it to test your cables to make sure that they're working. Most of the multimeters have like a buzz feature. So like on the Sperry one that I use in my workshop typically, you can set it to a buzz feature, and you can just like hold it to the tips of each side of a cable and to the sleeves of each side of the cable, and it'll buzz if it's making connection. It's easy for you to tell like if something's working appropriately, and you can kind of fit them into small spaces. I think that's probably the thing that I would say if you're starting out and you want to get a multimeter, that's like the best way to use it, I think. I'm trying to think of like any other really simple things that you could be using it for. I think that's typically what I'm doing it for. Sometimes I'll use it. Another thing you can use it for is to make sure that you're getting the right voltage. Like sometimes people that have like Voodoo Lab pedal powers and have all those dip switches on the bottom, they accidentally flip one and it's at 12 volts, you can, set it to DC, and you can, put, one side of your probe into the tip and one on the sleeve, and then you can see what voltage is coming out at the end, ensure that you got the right voltage going to every pedal. Usually those are kind of like two really easy ways to use a multimeter and make sure that you're got your cables made appropriately, that you get the right voltage going to the pedals. I think those are two easy ways. There's obviously hundreds of different ways that you could use it. I think that those are probably two easy ways you could start out using without really any training at all. Let's go to and hey from the Netherlands. People are coming from all over. This is from Tommaso. Do you have any tips on using the Vertex Steel String Supreme with a solid state amp? I mean, I would say that the approach would be pretty much the same as using it with a tube amplifier in terms of what it is that you're looking for. I don't know that there's any real distinction that I would say to use there. The JC40 can be a little stiff. So I would say that adding a little bit more of kind of the kind of the fatness control can really help with that, and blending in that clean sound through the pedal. I think that those two things kind of help. You might want to exaggerate those a little bit more than you would with an ordinary tube amp, just to give it a little bit more of that bounce. But otherwise, I think it'll be a really similar principle, Tommaso. I think that, and if you have any trouble, just email us and we'll be happy to guide you through that. Let's see. Next question: technical details on what he's talking about our Steel String Supreme in terms of what the bright and deep switch do and what the jazz and rock switches do on the Steel String Supreme. So bright and deep will kind of give you, obviously, brighter will make it brighter. Deeper will exaggerate the bass a little bit more. And then there's a middle position, which is just the bypass. And then the jazz and rock, the jazz one will make it a little bit warmer in the mid-range. And then the rock will give you a little bit more of a mid bite to it. And they're very subtle controls. It's not like a huge difference. It's kind of like a fine tuner of what the filter control does and what the fat control does. So it's kind of like a fine tuning of that. So you can use those to kind of help just exaggerate. They're like 5% differences. They're not very drastic differences. So if you're finding that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference, it's because it's only designed just to give you little tiny shifts and pushes in really specific areas. Let's see. I'm watching this while I'm playing my Ultraphonics and Steel String. Awesome. I'm going to take another question from here just because we want to make sure we're getting to everybody. We only got about 2 minutes left before we switch to the private stream. So Sean Tubbs, good to hear from you, man. What do you think about cable gauge within the context of pedal boards? This is a great question. So we did a video really recently about patch cables on the pedal boards, and the determination was if you use a high quality buffer, the difference doesn't really matter. The difference between the cable A and cable Z were almost nullified. You could hardly hear a difference. The differences that you could hear before the buffer was present was very drastic compared to the differences that you could hear when the buffer was engaged. So as soon as the buffer was engaged, it was like all the cables were almost identical. So any like a 20% difference between them became a 3% difference. So in terms of the thickness, I mean, like obviously you wouldn't want to go to something that's paper thin, but the two cables that were the most popular amongst all the people that we pulled, and even anecdotally when I've done this test here in a less controlled environment, are both thinner cables, the Mogami 2314 and then the Lava Tightrope. They're not like super thick gauge cables, and there's a downside to using thick gauge cables on a pedal board because there's not a lot of flexibility. So when you're trying to make these hard turns and things like that, it's just not that workable on a pedal board. So I think that what this test had told me when I watched it was that it really doesn't matter so much the cable on the pedal board. You should go with, kind of something that's right around 30 picofarads. Everything was kind of in that range. I don't think exceeded at 30, 35 picofarads per foot. And that's easy to assemble, and then using high quality plugs, we're using square plugs usually is our recommendation. And there's really very little difference. So I would say, something that's thinner like a 2314 is not going to be a deficit. I think if you're trying to use something really, really thin, maybe that could be a problem. But I think most of the guitar cables now, in the context of a pedal board that are out there that are commercially available, they all I think you're gonna see pretty much the same thing. That high quality buffers on both sides. It's not going to matter what you got. They're all going to be almost the same. Um, so that's my advice, Sean. 2314 from Mogami, square plugs. You're going to have plenty of room. They're flexible, easy to assemble, and we have a cool DIY tutorial video that it would be good to watch just to get a little crash course on it. So, guys, that was 45 minutes, and I'm sorry to any of you whose questions that I didn't get to. I tried to get to the super chats. I think we got to any of the super chats that came in. So, thank you all for watching. And again, if you want to kind of join us on our private stream, we're going to finish the final 15 minutes of the hour there. So you can join us if you want to kind of see more about what it is that we do over on the private stream. You can check that out here. Where is it? You can check that out here on the rigdr.com. We have group membership levels that you can check out, and it's if you just go to the Tone Consulting, you'll see that we have different tiers available. And again, if you cannot afford the basic tier at $7 a month, you can request a free account. We grant 100% of the free accounts, and this will give you access to our private streams. It'll give you access to some of the exclusive content that's only available to people that are members. And all you need to do is send us an email, no means testing required, and we will give you a free account to this. And if you can afford to pay for it, great. We appreciate your support, but also happy to give it to you if there's anything that stands in your way for being able to do that. We don't want money to be what stands between you and great tone. Thank you all, and we'll see you later.